Hey, fellow disciple makers, welcome back into the Be One Make One Life on Mission training. We're learning to practice the 6 skills of Jesus. And when we put these skills into practice, we learn to grow, to become more like Jesus, and then we go where Jesus goes. So how did it go for you this past week as you learned the skill of lift your heart? We want to remind you that lifting your heart certainly uses the discipline of prayer, but it's not the same as prayer, is it? We reflected on the way we entrust our heart to God. That's really what lifting your heart is. It's lifting your plans, lifting your pains, lifting your people to God, and then grabbing those promises that God has made to you, to each one of us, and letting God work in your heart. Such a valuable skill that we need to continue to learn and grow in so we can be more like Jesus and then go where he goes. Now, this time we're going to turn our attention to the next skill. The next L is live in community. I want you to think about that word for a moment, community. The word community, if you look it up in the English dictionary, it really means to have something that you share in common. You hear that word common within that word, don't you? We commune with others. You and I have community when we share something. We live in the same community, meaning that we live and share that space. That's how we use that term community. But the word community really is deeper for a believer, isn't it? It's not that believers, followers of Jesus, that we share some things. The Bible actually says we have all things in common. In Acts chapter 2, where the church was begun by the Lord, and we see Peter, he has a tremendous sermon. The gospel is preached. 3,000 people come to the Lord that day, are baptized. And then there's this description at the end of Acts 2 about what life looked like for the believers. You see the term together a lot. Acts chapter 2, verse 44 says, all who believed were together, and they had all things in common. That summary is really what living in community is all about. We have everything in common. So what did it look like? You keep reading, verse 45 and 46 says, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all, as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts. So the skill of living in community really is a description of what it looks like to live as a disciple of Jesus. So why'd they live like this? Where'd this come from? Well, like every time we go through these skills, we're going to point back to Jesus, aren't we? This is how Jesus lived his life on earth. He shared his life with his disciples. Let's go back to Mark chapter 2, and let's see some things that Jesus shared when he lived in community. Mark chapter 2, verse 13 to 17. He went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. And as he reclined at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Jesus lived in community with whom? We see right here, we see his disciples were with him as he was passing along by the sea. Then he welcomes a seeker to him, Matthew, or Levi, as he's called in this text. Then he's with those quote unquote sinners, tax collectors. So he lived in community with people at all different places along the path. And the first thing we noticed that he shared was he shared the mission. He shared the mission with those he was living in community as he was inviting others to live in that community with him. Paul the Apostle says in Philippians 1:5, he says, your partnership in the gospel. He uses that phrase, partnership. It's the same term we see several times in the New Testament, koinonia in the Greek, which really means to share, to participate, have things in common, or we would say live in community. Here's the thing. When we share the mission, it automatically makes us share our resources. We have all things in common. I want you to picture like a team that's working together toward the same goal. When we're on the same team and we fight the same battles and we aim at the same target, it encourages us to share our resources. Living in community is just like that. Being on the same team, aiming at the same target, and therefore we share the mission, don't we? The second thing we see in Mark chapter 2 here is that Jesus shared a meal. So real practically, when Jesus was sharing life, he shared meals. We see this all through the New Testament. In fact, it is definitely a characteristic of Christianity. If you've grown up in the church, you've had this experience, haven't you? You've been to meals in other people's houses. You've had potluck meals, maybe at church buildings and things like that. But we need to see our lives as constantly thinking of how can I share life with others? And the way I do that practically is around the table. I remember growing up with my siblings. One thing you could not do is you could not end the day with all those grievances you have toward your siblings, because we would eat around the table. I'm forced to look at those I might have disagreements with and I might have struggles with. I'm forced to look them in the eye, and we got to figure it out, don't we? Because we're sharing a meal. Practically speaking, sharing meals is the way we live in community. So, and we see that in Jesus' life. We see him sharing the mission. We see him sharing meals. If we move further through the gospel account, we see Jesus sharing a third thing that he encourages us to do. He shared his heart. In the last skill, we learned to lift our hearts to God, didn't we? Now, before we lift our hearts to God, we need to be aware of what's in our hearts. And we lift those things to God. But Jesus also shows us that that's not the only place we go with our hearts. We also share our hearts, our plans, our pains, the people in our lives, and the promises that we need to grasp. We see a great example of this in Mark chapter 14, verse 33 and 34. And he took with him Peter and James and John, and he began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. So Jesus shared what was in his heart, didn't he? He said, my soul is sorrowful, his pain that he had. He had also talked about his plans with them several times about how he was going to go to Jerusalem. He was going to be killed. He knew that, even though they didn't totally understand it. And here he was with that inner community, Peter, James, and John, those three, that tight-knit three. He shared that with them. Jesus models the great way of living in community is sharing our hearts with others. And if Jesus chose to do this, then certainly, it's needful for us. So living in community is sharing the mission. It's sharing meals. It's sharing our hearts. But the fourth thing that we want to show you is that Jesus encouraged us to share the word. In John chapter 15, verse 12 to 14, we see Jesus says this. He says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. So you hear that, those phrases, commandment, command, doing. He's talking about obeying his word. Jesus not only wanted to live in community with his followers, but he was helping them live in community with one another. That's what he does for us. He wanted them to love one another. Notice the way Jesus helps his followers love one another and share life and live in community. It's through sharing his word. He said, "You are my friends if you do what I command you." Earlier in the text, he says that this is how we find great joy. If you back up in John 15, verse 10 and 11 says, "If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I've spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full." Oh, I love that verse, right? So he says, I want you to have fullness of joy. And what happens is we share the word of God with those we're living in community. And that helps us then share life. That helps us share the love of Jesus that's in our hearts with one another. So ultimate joy is found in sharing life with other believers through sharing his word. So I wonder if John, who wrote these words down, who was there and had that experience, I wonder if he was thinking about this when he wrote later. Years later, he wrote in 1 John chapter 1, verse 6 and 7. He said, "If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin." What John, I think, is saying here is he's saying, Jesus wants you to live in community, but that's not easy, is it? So we know that what Jesus did, and we know what he's instructing us to do, but let's finish up by thinking about how, and let's just go ahead and admit it's not easy. There are people in your life that you know you have things in common with in Christ, but it's hard to live in a community with them. Might be that, unfortunately, we're just annoyed by others sometimes, right? We just don't get along. People have that with me, and they have that with you. They're annoyed with us. But I think there's something underneath here that John was mentioning that helps us bring out the truth. Community requires vulnerability. It forces us to walk in the light. Did you hear that phrase? So we can't keep our lives hidden in darkness when we live in community. We got to come out into the light. When we realize Jesus in his word has higher standards than the world does, and then we also realize we often don't live up to those standards. What do? Many of us, unfortunately, retreat from living in community. This is why this skill is so big. It's huge. We need to continue to live in community with other believers because it brings out Jesus in me and in others. What do people do instead of living in community? From personal experience and then watching others, I see at least two things. Instead of living in community, first of all, people often retreat to hide their faults, and they limit their Christian fellowship to church services. Notice none of these skills are going to church, quote unquote. Living community involves me going to the worship assembly, but it's not enough because I can go sit in a church pew and I can just hide my faults and retreat from others and make that the extent of my quote unquote community. And that way I don't have to confess sin and I don't have to let others see the true self, but I'm not going to grow to become like Jesus that way. I've got to live in community. I've got to walk in the light. Number two, unfortunately, what we also see is when people realize this, they'll retreat from living community, and what they'll do instead of community with other believers, they'll go find community with the world. Those who don't live by higher standards of Jesus and his word. We all want community. Since the beginning of time, we have been wired for relationship. But relationships are tough, aren't they? So how does a disciple of Jesus practice living in community with the threat of being hurt, with others seeing their faults? We've been burned, haven't we? How do we take that next step? Here it is. It's the same way we practice each of these skills through our relationship with Jesus. These are the skills of Jesus, and I'm a follower of Jesus. That's what I do. I get myself behind him. And then when I have community with you, Jesus is in between you and me. So I see you through Jesus, and I see myself through Jesus. The great theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he said this in his book, Life Together. He said, our community with one another consists solely in what Christ has done to both of us. I have community with others, and I shall continue to have it only through Jesus Christ. When you share life with other believers, always picture Jesus between both of you. What Jesus sees in you is what you bring to the relationship. What Jesus sees in your friend is what he or she brings to the relationship. Then we can truly share life, can't we? So let's begin to learn more about living in community as a disciple of Jesus. The exercises in the guide are going to help you do that. Additionally, in this skill, we're also going to learn what it is to live in a community group and what that looks like, how that works, the function of that. It's an effective way for disciples of Jesus to meet together, share life, share meals, share the mission, and share his word. The other thing about this is when we learn this community group practice, it's a method, it's going to help us practice the next skill of share the message. Because these groups will help us not only enjoy community with those who are already followers, but also welcome those who haven't made that commitment yet. Remember what Jesus did, right? He shared life with followers, but also with seekers. It's exciting to live with Jesus, isn't it? To practice the skills of Jesus, living on mission with him. So let's go ahead and jump into these exercises. Let's practice the skill of living in community. We'll see you soon.